start. So today we want to speak to you about your book, which is coming up now. So why does everyone seem so extreme on social media? What does your research show?
I think, it's become fashionable to blame social media companies for our current situation. And certainly they're part of the problem. There has been a number of missteps by multiple companies that I think everybody would agree. But, the kind of common suspects that we talk about when we talk about polarization, things like echo chambers, things like foreign misinformation campaigns, things like algorithms that radicalize us. These are very seductive ideas, especially when they are articulated by the same people who built the platforms and now kind of regret their actions. So there's this kind of, new idea of, tech created the problem and now tech is going to fix everything. But when we social scientists have actually started to scrutinize these ideas, we've found some surprising things. So for example, we've found that being exposed to a foreign misinformation campaign, at least in the case of the United States, and at least in the case of the Russia-linked Internet Research Agency campaign, had very little effect or even no effect on people's views about policy issues and even about each other. And this stands in really stark contrast to the idea that the Russian Internet Agency really, had a major effect on kind of fomenting civil unrest and partisanship in the US. Similarly, the idea that algorithms radicalize us has become very seductive, especially when partnered with the idea that social media platforms are profiting off this idea. But to the extent that we've been able to study this, and it's a difficult thing to study, we found that this phenomenon is extremely rare. Probably less than 2% of people are radicalized by algorithms, and maybe as few as 1 in 100,000. So really, even though these ideas would provide an easy fix, it would be easy to say, well, Facebook, stop radicalizing people, or, Twitter, do a better job fighting misinformation. Really, on balance, there doesn't seem to be a ton of evidence that either of these ideas on their own would solve the broader issue of how we're so divided on social media.
And how did you go about collecting this data? Did you work, Facebook gave you access to some of their data collection methodology and algorithms? Because I believe those are quite a sort of company secret, but I know also they open up part of it to researchers like yourself. So tell us a little bit, how did the process of researching for all these topics worked out?
Sure. Well, you're absolutely right that these things are difficult to study, and that Facebook and other companies have not always shared all the data that researchers might want. On the other hand, we're living through what many people are calling the golden age of social science. We have more data about human behavior than ever before. And that's got many of us very excited about the potential to solve problems like political polarization on social media. And we've been able to get creative about the ways that we can study this phenomenon. So Twitter has been fairly generous in sharing its data with folks, and also allowed researchers like us to run certain types of novel experiments where we're able to, for example, pay people to take a survey and then follow bots that we create that expose them to opposing views. And of course, we did this because we suspected that taking people out of their echo chamber, so to speak, would make them more moderate. Unfortunately, that's not what we found. We found that nobody became more moderate when we took them out of their echo chamber, at least most people didn't. And many people, and particularly Republicans, became more polarized as a result of this experiment. So that's one of the ways that we've been able to study this. And then Twitter, for example, has generously shared a lot of information about foreign misinformation campaigns, which we've been able to link to our data in order to measure concretely, for one of the first times, I think, what happens when people are exposed to misinformation. I think we all kind of have an outdated view of how social media works. What many of us would like to think is that we go on social media and we encounter information, we scrutinize it, and then we decide if it's useful or not, and then we incorporate it into our worldview and kind of proceed accordingly, right? But clearly, as anyone who spends any time on social media knows, this is not the way that social media works. People aren't calmly updating their views of the world and dispassionately discussing the merits of arguments. No, social media has become instead more like a tool for creating and protecting our identities. In fact, we could even debate about whether any kind of forum ever existed where we really had that kind of dispassionate, rational interaction that I just described. But certainly under social media, we've seen much more virulent fights about identity instead of information. And so I think one of the key things we need to think about as we look forward to solutions is how do we create an infrastructure for social media that promotes social cohesion and takes us outside of our all-too-human instinct to protect our identities and instead encourages us to work together, even if that seems like a tall order right now.
If social media platforms are so deleterious to democracy, why not delete our accounts? Deleting our accounts is just not realistic, you say. But I hear that people claim they deleted it and they are happier for it. What did you find out?
Sure. So again, this has become a really fashionable idea. If social media is so bad, why don't we all just delete our accounts? And you're right that during several periods over the last few years, there have been mass movements to delete accounts. And we've seen, high profile celebrities delete their accounts, and many people post on Twitter or elsewhere that they're deleting their Facebook account or their Twitter account and so on and so forth. But the problem is that we've become so reliant on social media as a society. So we only need look to young people to see evidence of this. Young people in the United States, but also, of course, elsewhere, are spending untold amounts of time on social media. They really grew up with social media, and they depend upon it for their kind of social connections. Now, we could debate about whether those are good, high-quality social connections, but I think the more important question is, can we imagine a future where we don't use social media to some strong degree, especially during a period of such social isolation? I think the COVID pandemic has laid bare how much we now depend on social media to understand each other, to communicate with each other, and especially around politics. So a study just came out a few days ago that shows very large segments of the US population live in areas where they will never encounter someone from the other political party. And we've seen some similar trends in other countries, even if they're not as marked as they are in the US. And that suggests to me that social media, for better or worse, and maybe for worse, will be one of the few places where we can have cross-party and productive dialogue about social media. So we need to do something. We need to make social media into the place where that can happen.
Yes, indeed. That's what you state in your book, that social media has become so woven into the fabric of our lives, and particularly those of young people, that it is here to stay. There is no doubt about it. But the good news is this, you say, if we social media users are the main source of political polarization, this means that we also have the power to push back against it. Can you tell us a little bit what sort of understanding and recommendations you came to after sifting through the data? So
the title of the book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, refers to this analogy of the prism. So we are not seeing real life, we're seeing a reflection of what's happening on social media. Probably the most important thing I think your audience should understand is that the vast majority of people talking about politics on social media have very extreme views. So the problem is that we then start to confuse extremists with moderates, a phenomenon that social scientists often call false polarization. So we start to think that everyone who is tweeting really genuinely represents the views of the other side, and we misunderstand that everybody is more polarized than they really are. So the first thing I think we need to do is become aware of this social media prism, the tendency of social media to distort our politics. And one of the things I'm most excited about is the technology we've been able to create in the Polarization Lab that's designed to help people not only become aware, but really make them into habits, to try to use tools, apps, bots, and other kind of quizzes that we've created on our website that allow people to try to diagnose the political views of the people that they're interacting with, to try to identify political trolls whose main goal may be to antagonize them rather than to have a productive conversation, and so on and so forth. Second thing we can do is become more introspective and reflective social media users. we can start to think about how our own behavior contributes to the broader problem. I'm not saying that everybody is an extremist. Clearly, many people have very moderate views. The problem is that through the power of the social media prism, most moderates seem invisible. If the majority of the people posting about politics have extreme views, there's this huge vacuum of people in the middle. And there's very good reasons why people with moderate views don't want to post about politics on social media. Maybe they're worried about antagonizing a friend or a colleague or a family member. Maybe they've been threatened online. That's now the most common reason people have been threatened on social media right now, their political views. So this is another challenge. And finally, we can begin to engage in more productive conversations across party lines. So our lab has created a bipartisanship leaderboard. So this tracks the types of people who are making social media posts that get traction or likes by both, in the case of the US, Republicans and Democrats. And that allows us to then try to boost those moderate people through bots and other technology to try to increase their exposure. Our research indicates that simply exposing yourself to the other side can actually make you more polarized. So even though it's important that we all know that things are very different and observe that in many ways we're living in different realities, we also need to be careful about how we step outside our echo chamber. If we just naively smash our echo chamber and begin exposing ourselves to everyone on the other side, we're probably going to focus on those small group of extremists who will maybe only make us feel more polarized. So what we're trying to do is say, here are tools to help you step outside your echo chamber in a more productive way by identifying people with whom you can at least agree to disagree, rather than extremists who may polarize you further.
So the tools you are developing are in some way media literacy tools or social media literacy tools that would help people. You could download, it's an app, I believe, right? You could download and then share with your family and friends who have opposing views and try to bridge your understanding of the political landscape, you'd say?
Exactly. Yeah. I think your idea, your term social media literacy is very relevant. We need a new set of training, a new set of tools to learn how to put social media in a place that makes it a net positive and not a net negative. Now that's not an easy thing to do. We can all say we're going to become more aware and try to be less polarizing, but we hope that this technology will make that into a habit and make it easier to practice by, for example, bots that can repeatedly expose you to messages that we think will be, depolarizing, rather than having to each day log on and try to do the hard work of building bridges on social media, which frankly can feel futile at a moment that's as polarized as ours.
But what is the problem with the algorithm design then, right? How do you train? Because they design precisely to create engagement through this feeling of extreme views, right? So the algorithm design plays an important role. And there is a limitation, is what I hear a lot too, because in the beginning, when all this discussion came to the fore, particularly in the light of Cambridge Analytica scandal, that media literacy, social media literacy was really important. But now it's not enough, we realize too, because the algorithms are designed in a certain way. And because the companies are private companies, you cannot ask them to look under the hood and say, you should change the algorithm, because they are monetizing that kind of extreme views. So what do you say is the challenge there then, in terms of, looking under the hood?
Yeah, I do think there is a role for social media companies to try to enact some reforms to the design of their algorithms that could help, promote social cohesion. So, for example, we know that people are engaging in status-seeking behavior. They're saying extreme things because they like getting likes and they like getting new followers. What if instead of boosting divisive content, social media platforms boosted or upranked the content that really resonates across both sides? Even more, what about creating new forms of status that are attached to bipartisanship, that are attached to people whose ideas resonate with broad audience instead of just one side? These are the types of reforms that I think are plausible and that could be used to nudge people in the right direction.
So did you look in your recommendations too, you are looking at this aspect, or this is the theme for another book?
Well, at the very end of the book, we discuss a social media platform that we created for scientific research. We wanted to be able to turn on and off different features of social media and see how they polarize people or promote better behavior. And so, in the final chapter of the book, I discuss one of the latest experiments we did that suggests some really exciting new developments around anonymity. So even though we can think of anonymity as being a source of incivility, we find that it also allows people to focus on the content of people's arguments instead of the identities of the people who deliver them, possibly creating a more reflective structure and a future, goal for the redesign of social media.
The United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has presented a report yesterday. They have something called the Special Rapporteur. They are independent experts that look at thematic issues as they relate to human rights. And the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Fernando Varenas, presented yesterday a review of social media and how it was impacting hate speech, in particular in the direction of minorities, right? Mm-hmm. The Rohingya in Myanmar was one case. So he evaluated all these cases and presented the issues that there is a need right now to actually address head-on these issues of how these platforms promote hatred, promote hate speech, which ends in genocide in the case of the Rohingya and the displacement. 700,000 people were displaced, right? And this all happened facilitated by these platforms. Mm-hmm. So what did you touch upon this, and what do you see is the way forward?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems for all of us, researchers, policymakers, and others, is to move beyond the US context. Most of our research is about the United States, and you're absolutely right that in other parts of the world, the social role of social media is much different. In countries that don't have a strong, institutional infrastructure around the media, social media in effect becomes the media. And so there are very different dynamics at play. Dynamics that we don't yet understand very well. And so I do think, we'll be studying this issue for a very long time to come.
Yes, indeed. They are planning actually to start a working group, which, private
great.
sector actors, academics like yourself would be able to come in and participate, because indeed we need to debate and find solutions. Chris.
Nice to talk with you. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.